In the vast and complex tapestry of human existence, there are seasons of the year that, by convention, are tinged with specific nuances. December, in particular, rises as a bastion of hope, a luminous beacon of what the spirit yearns for: peace, love, affection, warmth, and an unbreakable sense of unity. Christmas festivities, with their aura of miracle and reconciliation, are often perceived as a sacred refuge, a sanctuary where the harshness of daily life dissolves into the sweet harmony of tradition and benevolence. However, this idyllic vision, though deeply rooted, does not always align with the raw and relentless reality. History, in its darkest pages, reminds us, with chilling insistence, that this narrative of uninterrupted joy is, often, a delicate illusion. It is crucial, at times, to draw back the veil of complacency and confront the disturbing truth that even in moments that should be of greatest rejoicing, darkness can weave its most ominous threads. This somber reminder does not seek to instill despair, but rather to catalyze a profound reevaluation of our own fortunes. It compels us to value with greater fervor every breath, every human bond, every moment of stillness and joy granted to us. It forces us to pause, to breathe deeply, and to recognize the fragility of our existence, the impermanence of all that we consider secure. Because not everything is guaranteed, not everything is bought in this ephemeral journey. Life is not an endless succession of Santa Claus smiles and joyful bells. Sometimes, tragedy strikes with unprecedented ferocity, dismantling the facade of normality and revealing the intrinsic vulnerability of our condition. It is in these abysses of horror where, paradoxically, we can find a greater appreciation for the simple yet profound joy of having those who accompany us, of knowing who we are, and of recognizing that each day is an invaluable gift. To understand the magnitude of such contrasts, we must move to a specific corner of the world, a place where natural beauty intertwines with a history of unimaginable misfortune. Our journey takes us to the heart of the United States, towards the northern regions of the state of North Carolina. Here, the landscape unfolds, a serenity that deceives the eye. Rolling hills succeed each other in an eternal ballet, carpeted by a dense and ancient covering of pine, oak, and maple forests that, depending on the season, change their attire in a symphony of greens, golds, and crimson. The air, often, feels crisp, imbued with the earthy scent of fallen leaves and the sweet perfume of pine resin. The intermittent song of cicadas in summer, or the whistle of the winter wind through bare branches, are often the only sounds that break the profound silence. It is in this idyllic setting, north of the bustling city of Winston-Salem, where a small and almost imperceptible community is nestled, Germanton. The roads that wind through this region are more like paths, narrow trails that today, for the most part, are paved, but that retain the spirit of old rural lanes. On both sides, modest wooden houses extend, scattered with apparent randomness, interspersed with vast expanses of cultivated land, predominantly, in the past, tobacco farms. This territory, for generations, was synonymous with tobacco cultivation, an industry that shaped not only the landscape, but also the character of its inhabitants. The fields stretched in a mosaic of green, then yellowish leaves, under the relentless sun, promising a prosperity that rarely fully materialized for those who worked them. These roads, through which one travels today with an almost forgetful placidity, with minimal traffic that barely disturbs the quietness, plunge into the depth of the forests. Here and there, glimpses of a simple beauty emerge: a traditional architecture house with its cozy porch, a landscape that captures the essence of rural America, a small wooden bridge that arches its back over a murmuring stream, whose cold and crystalline waters reflect the sky. They are places of undeniable visual gratitude, living postcards of an existence that seems to be in perfect harmony with nature. However, behind this facade of peace and bucolicism, under the veil of peaceful beauty, stories are hidden. Stories that, when unearthed, reveal the brutality and inexplicable darkness of human nature. Stories like Charlie's, a name that resonates with a disturbing echo in the annals of this quiet corner of North Carolina. Let us lift the curtain of time and delve into the life of Charlie Lawson. He was born at the dawn of the Belle Epoque in the year 1886, a period of profound social and economic transformations in the United States. His father was not a landowner. He was a tobacco farmer. Yes, a man who plowed the land with the same tenacity with which he cultivated his dreams. But that land did not belong to him. He was, in essence, a sharecropper, a farmer who lived and worked on someone else's property. In exchange for the right to reside and cultivate the land, Charlie's family was forced to work tirelessly, from dawn to dusk, with the promise of a portion of the harvest. However, a considerable part, the largest and most lucrative, invariably ended up in the hands of the true owner of the property, leaving the family with just enough to subsist. It was a relentless cycle of effort and subsistence, an existence marked by dependence and uncertainty. Charlie, along with his siblings, among them Celia and Marion, knew the meaning of hard work from the tenderest childhood. Their hands, still small, would toughen with the earth and the sun. Their bodies would get used to the physical demands of agricultural labor. From a very young age, life imposed an unbreakable forge on them, shaping in them a rugged character, a resilience that bordered on stony tenacity. They were not people of fine manners, but of firm convictions and an iron work ethic. And, furthermore, one should not be deceived by the current peacefulness of these landscapes. When winter settled over North Carolina, the region transformed into a freezing and ruthless wasteland. Temperatures dropped drastically, often below zero, and snow could cover everything with a heavy white blanket, isolating communities and exacerbating the lack of resources. The people of these latitudes learned to survive under extreme conditions, to make do with what little they had. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the economic context was even more precarious. The echoes of the Civil War and the War of Independence still resonated, and the nation, in its eagerness to consolidate and expand, struggled through cycles of crisis and slow recovery. The rural economy, in particular, was a constant challenge. There were no safety nets, no cushion to soften the blows of a bad harvest or illness. Thus, the Lawsons had to live an existence of privations and a daily struggle for survival. Every meal was a victory, every day of work a battle won. This environmental and economic harshness, coupled with the discipline imposed by religion, forged Charlie into a man of few words, measured gestures, and unbreakable determination. With the passing of the years, the children of the Lawson family grew up, and Charlie, in particular, stood out for his physical strength and his unbreakable work ethic. They were active members of a church that, by modern standards, might seem somewhat peculiar, the Primitive Baptist Church. This cult was characterized by its hermeticism, its literal and severe interpretation of the Scriptures, and its strict moral code. It was not a church that embraced indulgence, but rather preached righteousness, abstinence, and discipline. The Lawsons, imbued with these teachings, were considered correct people in the community. Charlie, for example, never tasted a drop of alcohol in his entire life, a testament to his moral rigidity and his adherence to the principles of his faith. Within the family, severity was the norm, a reflection of the education his own father had imparted to him, an iron discipline that, as we will see, would have its repercussions in the future. But, returning to Charlie's life trajectory, his dedication to work was undeniable. At 25 years old, in 1911, amidst the routine of the fields and the demands of rural life, Charlie Lawson found what was described as the love of his life. She was Franny Minear, a 9-year-old bud, a cut of a girl, as she was poetically known in local slang. Franny was a young woman of fresh beauty and lively spirit, whose presence brought a new air to Charlie's methodical life. Their first interactions were, as dictated by the customs of the time, brief exchanges of words, furtive glances, and supervised encounters. Soon, those they-made words evolved into a formal courtship, a period of wooing under the scrutiny of both families and the community. The bond between them strengthened, cemented in mutual respect, industriousness, and the expectations of a shared life on the farm. Charlie Lawson and Franny Manier joined their lives in marriage. Married life, as expected, involved incessant work. Charlie, with his reputation as a tireless worker, ensured that, although money was never abundant, it was always sufficient. His income, modest but stable, was enough to support himself and his young wife. And, as was customary in those times and in that region, the family began to grow rapidly. Just 1 year after their wedding, in 1912, their first daughter was born, whom they named Marie. The arrival of the firstborn brought new joys and responsibilities, and the small Lawson home was filled with the sweet sounds of childhood. But the family did not stop there. Shortly after Marie, in 1913, their first son was born, Arthur. Although his formal name was Arthur Lawson, everyone in the family and community affectionately knew him as Buck. From his early years, Buck revealed himself as a bright boy, endowed with remarkable physical strength, who promised to grow into a robust man, shaped by the same rigor of the land as his father. After Buck, the Lawson home continued to expand with the birth of William, and then another daughter, and another, in a succession that quickly filled the house with children's voices and growing demands. Each new birth, while a blessing, also represented additional economic pressure. The money that was once enough now stretched to its limit, and often, it was not sufficient. It became imperative to work even more, seek new opportunities, and expand horizons to secure the necessary resources for a constantly growing progeny. It was this need that prompted an important family decision. Charlie's brothers, seeking a more promising future, decided to move to Germanton, that small town we have already described. Charlie, hoping to offer a better future to his growing family, did not hesitate to follow them. Germanton's promise was one of greater possibilities, perhaps the opportunity to forge their own destiny, to own their own land, to build their own house, and cultivate their own field. It was the ancestral yearning of every farmer: independence, self-sufficiency, the ability to provide for their own without intermediaries. It was in Germanton, where the Lawson family continued its expansion. There, Mabel was born in 1917. Carrie, in 1920, the original text, has an error in the birth sequence and ages. I adjust it for temporal coherence and subsequent narrative. And then, in 1925, James, and in 1927, Raymond. Finally, in the year 1929, the cherry on top arrived, little Marilou, a charmingly beautiful creature who completed the numerous offspring. Life in Germanton, as anticipated, was one of arduous and uninterrupted work. From the first ray of sun until well into the night, days were consumed in farm labor. The older children, despite their responsibilities in the field, attended school, an institution that in those years was beginning to be more accessible in rural areas. On Sundays, without fail, the family gathered at Palmyra Church near Germanton, a fundamental pillar of their social and spiritual life. In the community, the Lawsons were known and respected as correct people. Charlie, in particular, enjoyed the reputation of being a man of his word, someone who fulfilled his dealings with unwavering rectitude. He was a hard-working, honest farmer who would never steal, but he was also a man of severe character. This duality was well recognized and, in a way, accepted at the time. Within the walls of their home, however, that severity took harsher forms. Punishments were a palpable reality. It was not uncommon for children to receive forceful blows, and Franny herself, Charlie's wife, was sometimes the target of his anger. Although to the modern eye domestic violence is an intolerable affront, in that era and in that region, still with certain hints of a less civilized society, it was not so unusual. Corporal discipline with rods or whips was a widespread practice, and leaving children outdoors for hours as punishment was a brutality that, unfortunately, surprised no one. Charlie, although not the cruelest man of his time, was neither a man of stone, much less a softy, in the face of what he considered disobedience or disrespect. When he returned home, exhausted from the strenuous work in the field, he expected to find food ready and an atmosphere of tranquility. The boys had to go out to play, away from his presence, without making noise. He also claimed his space of intimacy with his wife, something that, under the pressure of rural life and numerous offspring, sometimes became tense. On occasion, his hand would slip, exceeding the limits of what we would consider acceptable today. However, in day-to-day life, Charlie was perceived and respected as a good farmer, a man of tireless work, and a rugged individual in many aspects, with a temperance that allowed him to face the toughest challenges. An incident that illustrates his character occurred in 1918. While working on a third party's land as a sharecropper, he found himself needing to go to Germanton town to carry out a procedure related to tobacco sales. It was a market day, and the streets were more crowded than usual. The air impregnated with the scent of hay, animals, and the bustle of conversations. While there, amidst the crowd, a fortuitous incident triggered a sequence of violence. A man, an African descendant of imposing build, was pushing a cart or some heavy load, and due to carelessness, or perhaps lack of space, ran over Charlie's foot, causing him an injury. The pain and outrage prompted Charlie to turn around and angrily confront the man. The response was immediate and violent. That man, much taller and more corpulent than Charlie, lunged at him. Charlie, with his rugged temperament and wounded pride, did not back down. They engaged in a brutal street fight, fist to fist, amidst the astonishment of passers-by. Despite the disparity in size, Charlie, with strength forged by years of working the land, seemed to be winning the contest. But the violence escalated. The aggressor, in a desperate act, pulled out a dagger. With lethal speed, he stabbed Charlie. A deep wound in the chest and another, even more dangerous, in the head. The shouts of the people and the intervention of other merchants finally managed to separate the contenders. Charlie, seriously injured, was rushed to a hospital. Survival prospects were grim. Doctors did not hold much hope. While Charlie fought for his life, the aggressor, who had managed to escape in the confusion, was tracked down and captured shortly after by the sheriff. He remained in prison, awaiting Charlie's outcome. Contrary to all predictions, Charlie, despite not being tall, possessed a robust constitution and an iron will that allowed him to recover. He left the hospital, physically and emotionally scarred, and attended the trial. His aggressor, a man named McNeil, was sentenced to 2 years in prison. This incident, which by itself would have been traumatic for anyone, further forged the perception of Charlie as a man who did not bend to adversity. He was a dangerous man. McNeil, and although his sentence was relatively short, his shadow would loom disturbingly over the future. Charlie, once again, resumed his life and the strenuous work on the farm. Years passed, and the family continued to grow, with new births filling the home with life and, at the same time, new worries. However, in 1920, family happiness was marred by a devastating tragedy. William, the third child, the little boy, died suddenly. Pneumonia, a disease then relentless in rural areas without access to advanced medicine, took him away. Despite efforts, nothing could be done to save him. This loss struck Charlie with unusual force, opening a deep wound in his already rugged heart. William was not just another son. He was the little boy for whom he had a special affection, his favorite. William, born in 1914, would have been only about 6 years old at the time of his death, and his passing left an unfathomable void. He was the only one of his children who seemed to hold the key to Charlie's emotional armor. The only one who could sit beside him in silence, the only one with whom he could converse without the barriers of paternal severity. William was the privileged one to whom Charlie, in an unusual gesture of tenderness, shared his food. It was him whose hair he ruffled with affection, with whom he allowed himself to laugh heartily, whom he held in his arms, looking at him with a special sparkle in his eyes. Certainly, Marie, his eldest daughter, by 1920, at about 8 years old, was the apple of his eye for her delicacy. Carefully educated, refined in her manners, always neat with her immaculate little dress, and her hair carefully arranged by her mother, Marie was sweet and charming. However, she always maintained a certain distance, a formality inherent in her upbringing. Arthur, the son, known as Buck, at 7 years old, sometimes exasperated Charlie with his strong character and untamed spirit. Despite the blows and lashes he received as punishment, the boy endured, without shedding a single tear, a display of resilience that Charlie, in his own way, recognized and respected. But William was different. William was the one who softened the contours of Charlie's harshness, the one who offered him a refuge of innocence and unconditional love. His death, therefore, was a blow that was felt in the deepest part of his being, a brutal reminder of life's fragility. Even with his heart torn by William's loss, life, relentless in its advance, continued. After William, the Lawson family continued to grow, with the birth of Raymond, John, and finally, little Marilou. Years passed, and with them, the need for a more stable and secure future became more imperative. Charlie, driven by the desire to not let his family lack anything, dedicated himself to working with even greater intensity. He worked double shifts, accepted any extra work he could find, and with Spartan discipline began to save every penny he could. Every saved coin represented another step towards his yearning for independence. Finally, after years of effort and privations, Charlie managed to gather enough money for the down payment, and with his reputation as an honest and hard-working man as collateral, obtained a bank loan. His dream of owning his own land was about to come true. It was in mid-1927 when Charlie Lawson bought his own farm in a place known as Brook Cove Road. It was not just any property. It was a considerable farm with some 60-odd hectares of fertile land, which promised an economic independence he had never known before. At the heart of the property stood an old house, a wooden structure that, according to some local accounts, was over 100 years old. It was a rickety house, yes, with the charm and ailments of buildings that have withstood the passage of many decades, but it was his. In addition to the main residence, the farm had an imposing barn, also made of wood, a vital space for sheltering animals and tools. And, crucial for a tobacco farmer, it had another building dedicated to drying tobacco leaves, essential for processing the harvest. The land was suitable for cultivating various varieties, and most importantly, it had access to water, an invaluable resource in any agricultural operation. The place was, in effect, very well endowed, a true paradise for a farmer. The bank, confident in Charlie's word and work capacity, granted him the loan, with conditions that, for the time, were reasonable, an annual payment of $500. This agreement meant that, with his effort, the farm would be paid off in a relatively short time. And Charlie, true to his reputation as a man of his word, demonstrated his commitment. Despite not having worked the property for the entire year 1927, since the acquisition was in mid-year, he managed to pay the full annual amount when 1928 began. It was a testament to his dedication and his unbreakable work ethic. The purchase of the farm not only represented an economic milestone but also a symbol of his social ascent, of his ability to ensure the well-being and future of his numerous family. By 1928, with the family already settled on their own farm, internal dynamics had begun to change subtly, but with a profound impact. Arthur, the son known to all as Buck, although only about 15 years old, was no longer a child. He was a big guy, a corpulent and strong young man, with a physical presence that rivaled and even surpassed that of his own father. Despite attending school and fulfilling his academic obligations, Buck spent most of his time forging himself in the fields, developing impressive musculature and stature. He was taller than Charlie, a fact that did not go unnoticed, and that, in an environment where physical strength was a symbol of authority, began to redefine the family hierarchy. It was in this year that an incident occurred that would mark a before and after in the relationship between father and son. Something, it is not known exactly what, some task in the field was not carried out to Charlie's satisfaction. Perhaps it was carelessness, disobedience, or simply the irritation of a father who expected perfection. Charlie, true to his custom of strict discipline, approached Buck with the intention of giving him a beating. Things would not be as before. Young Arthur, with the imposing figure of a young man and the determination of someone who has reached a point of no return, did not let himself be intimidated. In an act of defiance that must have chilled Charlie's blood, Buck held his father's hands. With a firm gaze, and with a voice that admitted no reply, he retorted with blunt clarity, "You will never hit me again. I will never again allow you to hit me, my mother, or my sisters. From today on, I will watch over all of them." It was a categorical declaration of independence, an oath of protection that resonated in the air with undeniable authority. Charlie, confronted by the strength and conviction of his own son, had no choice but to back down. At that moment, he must have felt a complex mixture of emotions. Perhaps the humiliation of being challenged. But, according to some, also a deep pride in seeing the strength and courage he had cultivated in his firstborn. Whatever the emotion, the incident marked an irreversible change in family dynamics. The era of indiscriminate beatings had ended. Charlie, despite this break in patriarchal authority, continued with his life, his good days alternating with less favorable ones, as usually happens in the existence of any human being. However, a new and inexplicable turn of events was about to enter his life, an event that would precipitate an even deeper and more ominous change. Imagine the scene. Charlie was working on the farm, on a seemingly mundane but essential task for tobacco farming. He needed to dig a drainage ditch, a channel to divert water draining from the area where tobacco leaves were prepared, leading it to a nearby stream. It was a task that required concentration and, perhaps, more caution than he showed. He decided that the ditch should run parallel to an old wire fence, a precarious and rusty structure that marked the property limits. Armed with a hoe, he stood next to the fence and began to dig, immersed in the monotony of work, without paying too much attention to the latent danger hidden beside him. He continued, blow after blow, the shovel sinking and extracting earth, until, suddenly, the hoe snagged on a loose wire of the fence. The impact was dry and brutal. The hoe, propelled by Charlie's strength and the wire's resistance, bounced back with unexpected violence and struck his head. It was not a light blow. It was a severe concussion, to the point that when he was found shortly after, he lay unconscious on the ground, blood flowing from his wound. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows over his inert figure, the cold afternoon air accentuating the gravity of the situation. Immediately, Charlie was taken to the hospital. The doctor, with the limited diagnostic tools of the time, electroencephalograms, magnetic resonances, or the sophisticated methods that today allow us to scrutinize the mysteries of the brain, did not exist, examined him superficially. He did not detect, at least at first glance, significant anomalies or obvious fractures. He considered that, although the blow had been strong, Charlie would recover with rest. Thus, he was sent back home, where, after a few days of physical recovery, he was able to resume his work. However, and this is crucial, Charlie would no longer be exactly the same man. The blow to the head, that idiocy, as it came to be called, had altered something deep within him. The air on the farm became denser, charged with a new and subtle tension that no one could name, but everyone felt. Charlie began to suffer intense, throbbing headaches, which assailed him with alarming frequency and blinding ferocity. These episodes left him prostrate, literally confined to his room, unable to leave, plunged into physical and mental darkness. They were moments of absolute isolation, where neither the sound of the farm nor the voices of his family could penetrate the barrier of his suffering. He was a man who already had a history of being severe, not violently uncontrolled, but rigidly disciplined according to the standards of the time. In those days, brutality in family discipline, including hitting children and even wives, was unfortunately common in those rural regions. Charlie was not an exaggeration in this sense. He was not an atypical case of cruelty. But after that terrible blow, his behavior began to manifest strange, unsettling patterns that went beyond his usual seriousness. The air filled with an expectant silence, as if the wind itself held its breath. Suddenly, those strange little things began. Fanny, his wife, might be talking to him about the day's plans, the farm's finances, or family arrangements. A conversation in which, due to the trust Charlie placed in her for administrative and money matters, Fanny usually had considerable influence. Her opinion was valued, her advice often followed. But in the middle of the conversation, without warning, without a word, Charlie would abruptly get up and leave the room. One might think it was the machismo of the era, the man's ignorance towards his wife. But the reality was more complex. Charlie trusted Fanny. She was the de facto administrator. The most disturbing thing was that this behavior was not limited to his home. While in the town store in Germanton, talking to a neighbor, in the middle of a sentence, Charlie would turn around and leave, leaving the interlocutor speechless, perplexed, and bewildered. These episodes generated considerable strangeness and concern in the community. People murmured, cautiously observing the man who had once been so predictable in his rigor. But the most alarming episodes occurred in the darkness of the night. Suddenly, Charlie would wake up abruptly and rush out of the room, his heart beating with irrational fury, searching for his weapons. He owned a rifle, a double-barreled shotgun, and another single-barreled one, common armament in American rural homes back then, and even today. His sole objective was to ensure they were loaded, ready for an assault, an invasion. Paradoxically, in Germanton, in that quiet rural area, assaults and organized crime that plagued big cities, with figures like Dillinger, were practically non-existent. The region's sheriff had a relatively easy job. Peace was the norm. But in Charlie's mind, the threat was imminent, real. Then, that ugly thing happened. An incident that truly terrified Fanny and plunged the family into deep unease. One morning, Fanny woke up and did not find Charlie in bed. She looked out the window, the cold dawn air caressing her face, and distinguished recent footprints in the snow leading towards the forest. Concern prompted her to follow the trail. She walked, the crunch of snow under her feet breaking the winter silence, until she found him. There was Charlie, next to a solitary tree, on his knees, with a rifle lying beside him. He was crying and praying loudly, gesticulating towards the sky, completely lost in a kind of mystical delirium. His shouts were incoherent, his prayers strange, a desolate spectacle that left her frozen. Charlie was taken to the doctor again. The practitioner, limited by the medical science of his time, examined him again without finding really much of anything. There were no visible tumors, no structural anomalies that justified such behavioral changes. The diagnosis was, at best, vague, and the explanation, unsatisfactory. Meanwhile, at home, his own son, Arthur, the unbreakable buck, was forced to spend entire nights awake. The fear that his father, in the midst of one of those periods of madness, might lash out at his mother or siblings, was a constant nightmare. Arthur slept dressed, ready to get up at any moment, to restrain his father, to protect his family. The tension in the house was palpable, a silent premonition of the tragedy that loomed. Despite everything, the days slipped by. Farm life continued its course. Charlie, incredibly, remained a good worker, a successful farmer. His harvests were abundant, and his reputation in town as a hard-working man remained intact. They were not experiencing economic hardship. On the contrary, their financial situation was relatively good. Even, Charlie had begun to talk with his brothers about the possibility of building a new house. The old wooden house, although his, did not entirely please him. He considered it inadequate for the size of his numerous family. He yearned for a better home, built with new wood, a renovated space that would symbolize his progress and stability. He never explained to his brothers the exact reasons behind his desire to tear down the old house and build a new one, only insisting that the wood had to be new, without wanting to reuse the materials from the existing structure. This detail fueled the rumors already circulating in the region. Some said that the farm the Lawsons had bought had been acquired at a surprisingly low price because the place was haunted, that mysterious things happened within its walls. It was a local legend, one of those told by the warmth of the fire on winter nights. However, neither Charlie, nor Fanny, nor any of the children ever mentioned to anyone having experienced paranormal phenomena. Their only insistence was the need for a new house, an indication that, beyond any rumor, they were doing well. The year 1929 had passed. Until that moment, under a sign of good news, of prosperity. The arrival of little Marilou, a beautiful and healthy creature, had filled the home with joy. The farm was producing wonderfully, allowing them to pay debts in advance and accumulate resources. Times were good, or at least they were for the Lawsons, who, as tobacco farmers, were relatively outside the great economic crisis that was already beginning to brew in the country's financial centers. And there were more reasons for joy. Marie, the eldest daughter, a 17-year-old girl, had found love. Her boyfriend, a promising young man named Charlie Hampton, had a car. In 1929, owning a vehicle, however old, was a sign of status and a certain economic comfort, something that did not go unnoticed in the community. The Lawson family felt blessed by Marie's good future. Furthermore, the location of their farm on Brook Cove Road was strategic. It was very close to the homes of her uncles, Celia and Marion, which fostered constant gatherings of cousins. With 7 living children in the Lawson house and another 6 or 7 more among their brothers' families, it was a constant crowd, a whirlwind of children who played and had fun to their heart's content, making rural life a collective adventure. Thus, amidst the family bustle and the farm's prosperity, time advanced inexorably, and the cold December of 1929 settled in North Carolina. With the arrival of heavy frosts, the fields became unproductive, and people dedicated themselves to other tasks: shopping, stocking up on provisions, home repairs, and, above all, staying in the warmth of their homes. However, in mid-December, Charlie Lawson, the man of rugged character but, as we had said, not without gestures of affection, surprised his family with news that filled them with emotion. He announced that everyone would go to town. In that era, a trip to town was not a trivial excursion. It was a significant event, an escape from rural monotony. Life was hard, and small joys were valued immensely. And Charlie had another surprise in store for them. When the appointed day arrived, everyone, excited, climbed into the old wagon, a kind of adapted truck that served as family transport. The rattling of the vehicle over the snowy roads was music to their ears, each kilometer a promise of adventure. Upon arriving in town, the anticipation was palpable. Charlie led them directly to a clothing store. There, with an unusual smile on his usually serious face, he told Fanny to choose new clothes for everyone, whatever they liked best, something nice for each of their children. This gesture, although it may seem common today, was extraordinary for a rural family of that time. Much has been said that it was astonishing for a poor farm, but the reality is that the Lawsons were not poor. Their farm was productive. What was unusual was not the lack of money, but the custom. People did not buy new clothes frequently. It was normal for younger children to inherit clothes from older ones, and older ones, sometimes, from their parents. Only for very important events was some new garment acquired, but never for everyone at once. Charlie, breaking with tradition, opened his wallet and gave them the pleasure of wearing new clothes. The sparkle in his children's eyes must have been his greatest reward. After the clothing purchase, Another surprise came, even more significant at that time. The family would take a photograph. In the current era, where cell phones allow capturing 50 photos in a minute, the transcendence of this act is difficult to comprehend. But in 1929, taking a family photograph was a luxury, an event as expensive and rare as perhaps taking a long trip. Most families did not have albums full of photos. They barely possessed one or two, treasured as relics. For Charlie, it was an important moment. Little Marilou had just been born, and he wanted a portrait that would immortalize his entire family gathered. And here, before the observer's eyes, that photograph is presented. In it, Arthur, the big buck, 16 years old, stands on the left, his stature already prominent. Beside him, the beautiful Marie, 17, the girlfriend, with a notable presence. Then, Charlie himself, with his face marked by work and life. Fanny, the mother, holds little Marilou, the newborn, the cherry on top, in her arms. Below, seated, the youngest ones, John and Raymond. And the two girls, Mabel and Carrie. It is the complete family, a testament to life and unity. After this exciting day, with the photo taken and the new clothes put away, the Lawson family returned home. The euphoria of the trip to town and the surprises dissipated, giving way to the farm routine. They shed their new garments and put on their work clothes, ready for the days preceding Christmas. Charlie had spent money, yes, but not an excessive fortune. It was a pleasure he could afford, an act of love and family pride. Days passed, and Christmas arrived. On the farm, decorations were simple. Perhaps a snowman made by the children, some modest, homemade garlands. Gifts, as we know them today, were not a tradition. Christmas then focused on preparing a special meal, the only one of such magnitude all year, and inviting many people, visiting other houses. That was the true joy of the season: communion and sharing. Thus, as Christmas of 1929 approached, the Lawson family began preparations for the December 25th dinner, the key date of celebration in America. Unlike Latin Christmas Eve, there would be everything for the big dinner. Plans intertwined with the festivity. Marie, the eldest daughter, had a date that afternoon with her boyfriend, Charlie Hampton, before the family dinner. He would pick her up to take her to church. Charlie's brothers had also organized a gathering on the morning of the 25th. They would compete in target shooting with other farmers in the area, a recreational activity consisting of shooting at cans and bottles placed on logs. Laughter, jokes, camaraderie. The morning of December 25th dawned with a festive air. At the Lawson house, breakfast passed in an unusually cheerful atmosphere. Charlie, in a very good mood, chatted and laughed with his family, the breakfast seeming most pleasant to him. After eating, Charlie and his son Buck, along with Sanders, Buck's cousin who had spent the night on the farm to join the fun early, took their rifles and headed to the field. There they met other farmers, and the target shooting competition began with great enthusiasm. Shots echoed in the cold air, some hitting, others missing, laughter filling the atmosphere. Buck, as usual, showed great skill with the rifle. While the men indulged in fun in the field, on the farm, Fanny busied herself with Christmas dinner preparations, the kitchen air impregnated with aromas of spices and sweets. Marie, the eldest daughter, was baking a cake, a two-story creation that, with its fluffy layers, sweet filling, and white sugary frosting decorated with raisins, promised to be the grand finale of the dinner. It was a simple world, that of these people, where imagination and ingenuity supplied the lack of luxuries. And while Marie completed her masterpiece, thinking of her boyfriend's imminent arrival to go to church, John and Raymond, the two little boys, played silently with their toys. Little Marilou, oblivious to everything, rocked peacefully in her crib. The two older girls, Mabel and Carrie, were euphoric, embraced by the winter warmth of their heavy coats, their thick wool socks, and their sturdy winter shoes. They were ready to go to their Uncle Saliah's house, where they would spend a joyful time with their cousins. Mom gave them the last instructions, asking them not to delay too long. The atmosphere in the Lawson house was one of pure Christmas happiness. In that era, comforts were few. There was no television, no radio, no telephone, much less internet. A child, with luck, owned a single doll for their entire childhood, or a small toy car. But despite the material scarcity, people were content with little, and the joy of Christmas, though simple, was genuine. Down by the creek, the target shooting party continued. Other acquaintances had joined the revelry. Laughter and gunshots filled the air. Suddenly, as if a macabre sign of fate, someone spotted a rabbit. My God! Poor rabbit. What a bad idea to cross there at that moment. It was approximately noon. Charlie, who until that moment had been in excellent spirits, radiant with happiness, got up with the intention of hunting it. That day, he had treated Arthur, his son Buck, with unusual tenderness, almost with reverence. Arthur, the boy who had stood up to him, who had sworn to protect his mother and sisters, was his great pride. With a hand on his son's shoulder, Charlie said softly, "Hey, why don't you go to town? I'm going rabbit hunting in a while and I'd like you to come with me. We'll make a stew, but I have few munitions. Why don't you go with your cousin Sanders to town and bring me a box?" Charlie seemed the most sensible man in the world at that moment. His request logical, his tone affectionate. He took money from his pocket and handed it to Buck. Buck and Sanders, his cousin, were immensely pleased with the proposal. How could they not be? Going to town was a small adventure, a walk through the forest that promised to be pleasant. It meant an escape from routine, a brief immersion in the outside world. Buying a box of bullets was not a big deal, but the trip itself was exciting. Buck, in the euphoria of the moment, did not notice the detail that it was December 25th, a day when stores would be closed. His teenage mind only imagined the excitement of going to town, perhaps seeing a girl, buying some sweets or trinkets with the pennies he always saved. Driven by enthusiasm, Buck and Sanders ran off, leaving the farm and the apparent normality of the morning behind. Charlie, for his part, headed towards the forest. He probably checked his jacket, realizing he still had some extra cartridges left. He entered the thicket, with the excuse of looking for the rabbit, but with a much darker and inscrutable purpose nesting in his mind. In the house, Fanny, oblivious to the approaching storm, continued with her arduous labors, diligently preparing meals. Marie, the young and beautiful Marie, had finished taking the cakes out of the oven with which she would form the two-tiered cake, a spongy dough for the base and another for the top, which would soon be joined by a sweet filling. With expert hands, she began to cover the cake with a delicate white sugary glaze, adorning it with raisins, small dark jewels that contrasted with the immaculate whiteness. What a simple world! What delicacy in creation! What innocence in waiting! The little boys, John and Raymond, played with their modest toys, their childish laughter softly echoing in the home. Little Marilou continued peacefully in her crib, rocking, a beacon of life in a home that would soon be enveloped by the densest darkness. I know what you are thinking, dear listener. Where is the engineer taking this narrative? I ask for your patience, the patience to delve into the abyss. Marie, the pretty girl, was finishing the last details of her cake, while in her mind, the sweet anticipation of meeting her boyfriend, Charlie Hampton, to go to church, filled her thoughts. She decorated the cake with care, each raisin placed with love. Suddenly, the two older girls, Carrie and Maybelle, made their appearance. They were radiant with joy, already wearing their winter coats, their thick wool socks, and their winter shoes, ready for their adventure. They said goodbye to Mom with effusive hugs and left the house laughing, holding each other's arm, their youthful voices echoing in the winter air. The snow, which had fallen in a tremendous snowfall, was thick that Wednesday at noon, crunching under their steps as they walked joyfully. About 50 or 60 meters further, one of the main structures stood, the wooden barn. The two girls, laughing and singing, joking about their visit to Uncle Celia and their cousins, approached the barn. If I am correct, Maybelle was about 7 or 8 years old, while Carrie would have been about 12. Their happiness was palpable. The spirit of Christmas filled their young hearts. Just as they crossed the barn door, approaching the path that would lead them to their uncle's house, the figure of their father, Charlie, silently emerged from behind them. In his hands, he held a 12-gauge double-barreled shotgun, a lethal weapon that at that moment transformed into an instrument of horror. He aimed and fired. The blast broke the silence of the winter afternoon. Immediately, he reloaded, the metallic sound resonating with dehumanized coldness, and fired again. The projectiles penetrated Carrie's back with brutal efficacy, killing her instantly. The next shot directly impacted Maybelle, who fell lifeless. Charlie, with chilling coldness, approached the inert bodies of his daughters and examined them. He noticed that Maybelle was still breathing weakly. Without hesitation, he took the weapon and struck her head, ensuring that life completely abandoned the small body. He did the same with Carrie. The snow under his feet, which had previously crunched with his daughter's laughter, now silently absorbed the blood that began to stain it crimson. Immediately afterwards, with macabre premeditation, Charlie reloaded the weapon and leaned it against the barn wall. He took the bodies of his 2 daughters and carried them inside the dark structure. There, with disturbing meticulousness, he arranged them. He laid them side by side on the cold wooden floor, as if preparing them for a rest. He found a smooth stone which he carefully placed under each of their heads, simulating an improvised pillow. With his own hands, he closed the girls' eyelids and then crossed their small arms over their chests. He had murdered his 2 daughters. There were no screams, no laments, only the silence of death and the crunch of snow under his boots. After this atrocity, Charlie shook his hands, as if cleaning himself of visible dirt, took his shotgun, and returned towards the house. His figure silhouetted against the immaculate white of the snow, a dark stain on a landscape of deceptive purity. At that precise instant, Fanny, his wife, had stepped out of the house for a moment. She had been in the oven the whole time, in the suffocating warmth of the kitchen, and had sought the fresh air of the porch to catch her breath. She managed to see her husband approaching, shotgun in hand. Surely, she would have greeted him with a smile, with a question about the hunt. But Charlie did not respond to the greeting. In a chilling and unhesitating movement, he raised the weapon, which he had already reloaded with 2 new cartridges, and fired at point-blank range at Fanny. The impact was brutal. Fanny fell heavily onto the wooden floor of the porch, her inert body a lump on the wood. Charlie, with the same coldness, took the woman's body by the arm and began to drag it, pushing the house door, which opened with a mournful creak. Inside, Marie, who was finishing the last details of her Christmas cake, witnessed the scene. She screamed. She screamed in horror, her voice torn by terror at seeing her own father dragging her mother's corpse. But she had no time to react, to flee. Charlie, without any mercy, shot Marie in the chest. The young woman jumped from the impact and fell backward, the bullets shattering her heart. Charlie finished bringing Marie's body into the house, closed the door with a dry thud that echoed in the silence, and set out to look for the youngest ones. Raymond, despite his tender age, barely 2 years old at that moment, perceived that something horribly wrong was happening. With the intuition of survival, he hid behind the stove, a small refuge of metal and warmth. John, 4 years old, ran to his room, seeking shelter under the bed. He located John's room, climbed the bed ladder, and with brutal force threw it aside. He dragged his son, put him on the floor, and killed him. Then, he descended with little John's inert body to the ground floor. His next target was Raymond. He approached the stove, where the fire still burned, and tried to reach the child, who had hidden very deep. Charlie, despite the heat, tried to put his hand in, but couldn't. He took the shotgun, tried to yank the stove to open a gap, but it wouldn't budge. Finally, he hit and dragged the furniture, managing to pull little Raymond from his hiding place, and killed him. With the bodies of his children on the floor, Charlie went to the living room. There, with the same macabre ritual he had used with Carrie and Maybelle, he arranged the bodies of Fanny, Marie, John, and Raymond, one next to the other. He crossed their arms over their chests, gently closed their eyelids, and looked for pieces of wood to place under their heads, like pillows. Finally, he took the smallest one, baby Marilou, who lay oblivious to the slaughter, and tenderly placed her in her mother's arms. Everything was over. The silence that settled in the house was dense, heavy, charged with the horror of the acts that had just occurred. Charlie went up to his room, where he remained for a while, inscrutable in his madness. After an undetermined time, he left his room, descended the stairs, and, accompanied by his 2 dogs, left the house, carrying a shotgun, and entered the thicket of the forest, his figure disappearing among the snow-covered trees. While the massacre was being perpetrated on the Lawson farm, oblivious to the unfolding tragedy, Arthur, the boy known as Buck, and Sander, his cousin, continued their way to town. Their happiness was contagious. Their laughter echoed in the cold air, filling the journey with joy. Time passed, and upon arriving in town, reality struck them. All the stores were closed. It was Christmas. They couldn't buy the bullets. With a hint of resignation, but without losing their good spirits, they began the journey back home, completely unaware of the horror that awaited them. At the same time that Buck and Sander were returning, the girls' uncles, noticing Mabel and Carrie's unusual delay, began to worry. Celia, the uncle, decided to go to the Lawson farm to look for them. What he found upon entering the house left him horrified, a dantesque scene that chilled his blood. The sight was so appalling that he immediately called for help. Help arrived in the form of a neighbor who, after witnessing the scene, alerted the sheriff. News of the tragedy spread like wildfire throughout the community. While Buck and Sander were still walking back, Marie's boyfriend, Charlie Hampton, caught up with them in his car, his face distorted by terror, and shouted for them to get in, that something terrible had happened at their house. Upon arriving at the Lawson farm, everything was confusion. A crowd of people had gathered, their faces reflecting a mixture of horror, panic, and bewilderment. The question in everyone's mind was, what had happened to Charlie? Why had this happened? The confusion was enormous, and fear gripped the people. Many of the first to arrive, upon seeing the scene, fled in terror to their homes, arming themselves to the teeth, fearing that the tragedy was the work of some gang of criminals of the mafia that plagued big cities. The sheriff, a man of experience, began to go through the rooms, but something did not fit with the hypothesis of an external attack. The bodies were arranged, almost with a macabre reverence. The person who had taken their lives had taken care to cross their arms over their chests, to arrange them as if they were asleep, to close their eyelids. And then they learned the chilling truth. The 2 girls, Carrie and Maybelle, had been murdered in the same way, and their bodies lay in the barn. Chaos took over the scene. A light snowfall began to fall, erasing the few tracks that might have remained, further complicating the investigation. With so many people entering and leaving the house, any trace was irremediably lost. A scandal, an incomprehensible horror, shook Germanton. How could it be? What was happening? And where was Charlie? About 3 hours after Celia discovered the massacre, a solitary gunshot broke the silence of the forest. The sound, dry and definitive, sent a shiver down the spines of those waiting at the farm. Immediately, the sheriff and 2 or 3 other men ran in that direction, through the snow and trees. There, next to a solitary tree, they found Charlie. He had a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the chest, his body lying lifeless. Beside him lay the shotgun, the weapon of horror. The dogs, faithful until the last moment, were nowhere to be found. But there was something very, very strange around the tree. The snow, which had fallen thickly, was melted in a perfect circle around the trunk, as if Charlie had been walking incessantly, in circles, for the full 3 hours that separated him from the family massacre. The police, a modest town sheriff, began their investigation. To ensure maximum rigor, he requested the presence of doctors from the prestigious Johns Hopkins Institute, who arrived to examine the bodies and the crime scene. Step by step, with the meticulousness of those who seek truth in horror, they recreated the sequence of events I have described to you. There were no direct witnesses. No one saw Charlie shoot. But by reconstructing the movements, the location of the bodies, and the details of the scene, the sheriff and experts managed to piece together this terrible story I have just narrated to you. Yes, I have told you a terrible story. After the joy of a cake decorated with raisins, after the innocence of children's laughter, I have narrated how a father murdered his entire family. It is an incomprehensible atrocity. But the question that loomed over everyone was, what had happened? What on earth had gone through that man's mind? The bodies of the Lawson family were sent to be examined by doctors. Autopsies revealed the cause of death without a doubt. The medical report, chillingly clear, included a special section for Charlie. His brain was extracted for a more detailed autopsy. The results, however, were disconcerting. There was nothing strange. It was perhaps a slightly smaller than normal brain, but it showed no notorious anomalies, no tumors, no evident lesions that explained his behavior. In fact, Charlie's brain was sent to the Johns Hopkins Institute for a deeper analysis. But, mysteriously, it never returned, and nothing more was ever known about it. The mystery deepened. After the forensic examinations, the bodies of the Lawson family were returned for burial. In a single grave, in the cold ground of Germanton, 7 coffins were placed. Little Marilou, the newborn cherry on top, was laid in her mother Fanny's arms. Inside the same coffin, a last and unholy embrace. A single headstone, a single epitaph, marked the final resting place for the entire Lawson family. Questions, like persistent shadows, multiplied. What had happened? How was it possible that so many people had died in such a brutal and sudden way? The first hypothesis, the most obvious at first, was that of an external attack. Someone had broken into the Lawson house and perpetrated the massacre. But this theory crumbled under the scrutiny of the facts. The answers arising from this hypothesis did not coincide with the crime scene. Why would an intruder have killed little Carrie and Maybelle in the barn when they were fully dressed to go out in the snow? If it had been a mob of criminals, the girls would not have had time to get ready. Furthermore, the only initial footprints found in the snow, before the crowd and the new snowfall erased them, were Charlie's. Everything indicated that it had not been a group of evildoers who had entered the house. The evidence, cold and hard, pointed in only one direction. Charlie had killed his family. Another hypothesis that was considered was that of revenge. McNeil, that man who had stabbed him years ago, could have returned to consummate an act of retaliation. But 11 years had passed since that incident. It wasn't even known if McNeil was still alive. Why return to Germanton after so long? And, most importantly, why that strange and disturbing ritual of arranging the bodies, crossing their arms, closing their eyelids? It did not seem like the modus operandi of savage revenge. Furthermore, the way Charlie died, the self-inflicted gunshot, the fact that he had walked in circles for hours, did not fit with the idea of an attack. The hypothesis of an external aggressor was discarded. Only one main possibility remained. Charlie Lawson had gone mad and murdered his family. But even this explanation left a crucial question mark. Why had he sent Arthur, Buck, to the store? Why hadn't he told him, "Come with me to the house," and perpetrated the complete crime, also ending his life? Why had he spared the life of his eldest son? That question, that inexplicable exception, haunted the sheriff until the day he died. Every time someone asked him about the Lawson case, he returned to that point. I don't understand why Arthur. If Arthur was the only one who stood up to him and stopped him dead in his tracks, the first one he would want to take revenge on, why instead did he send him to town? If William, his favorite, had still been alive, perhaps he would have sent him in a final act of affection. But Arthur, the question persisted. a shadow in the sheriff's memory. And why the new clothes? Many thought it was a final act, a wild spending spree by someone who knew he was going to commit an atrocity and wanted to burn the money. But the reality is that it wasn't an incredible fortune. It was an expense Charlie could afford, and the photograph, that family portrait, was a way to remember his family, to immortalize them in a moment of joy. This man was thinking about his family, their needs, their memories, not about anything else. He bought them clothes because it was winter, because he had never bought new clothes for all of them before, and because he was treating himself. At the same time, he was planning to build a new house, which implied he had money to invest. The Lawsons were not spendthrifts. They didn't spend on superfluous things. But a family photograph was a tradition, a normal practice at the time. Therefore, at that moment, he was not thinking of committing an atrocity. The questions floated in the air, unanswered, the mystery persisting. It is possible that you, dear listener, have seen some television series or read some article about this case. And surely, you will have heard a third hypothesis. However, this theory emerged much, much later, specifically in 1990, that is, 61 years after the massacre. This third hypothesis, the most macabre of all, suggests that Marie, the eldest daughter, was sexually assaulted by Charlie himself, that there was a kind of incestuous relationship, and that she was expecting a baby. The basis of this hypothesis is the testimony of a friend of Marie who, in 1990, claimed to have heard Marie say that she was pregnant by Charlie, and that her father and mother, Fanny, knew about it. Another person also stated that her mother had heard Marie say the same thing. But let me tell you something. This hypothesis makes no sense. It makes no sense for 2 or 3 fundamental reasons. The first is the possible confusion. Marie had a boyfriend, and his name was Charlie Hampton. It is plausible that, so many years later, few people would genuinely remember that Marie, the beautiful eldest daughter with her delicately arranged hair, had a boyfriend named Charlie. The people who overheard the conversation might have misunderstood, assuming she was referring to her father. But there was something even more conclusive. One of the main witnesses of those statements, the woman who claimed to have heard the conversation, had died in 1928 at the end of that year. That is to say, long before Charlie and his family took the Christmas photograph, and therefore, long before the massacre. And in the photograph, if observed carefully, Marie does not appear pregnant. Therefore, for many cold case investigators, the story that Charlie Lawson would have been a sexual predator who attacked his own family made no sense whatsoever. Charlie was a severe, energetic type, but he did not fit that profile. Furthermore, a crucial detail must be taken into account. He had just had a child with his wife, little Marilou, barely 4 months before the massacre. Something does not fit anywhere in this third hypothesis. The photograph, analyzed by some with the preconceived idea that the gazes are strange, offers no conclusive evidence. And how could they not have serious gazes? A photograph in 1929 was not a spontaneous instant. It was a formal event. The photographer demanded, "Everyone still. Don't move." And the pose was expected to be held for 15 or 20 seconds for the light and film to capture the image. Obviously, the gazes were not like today's. Allow me to show you other old photos. Look at this person. Very serious. And these others, also very serious. And this complete family, with faces like, "Don't laugh or I'll hit you." Back then, it was not considered polite to smile for a photo. Seriousness was the norm. Consequently, the expressions in the Lawson family photograph are completely normal for the era. What then happened there? What went through this man's mind? Why, suddenly, did he lash out in such an inexplicable way? Allow me to present a final hypothesis, a much more macabre, almost supernatural theory. That day, everything had been fine. Charlie was happy. He was expecting visitors, had treated his family to new clothes. They had taken a family photo they would treasure. He was making plans to build a new house. He had paid the bank note, which meant his economic situation was stable and comfortable, despite the world plunging into the Great Depression. A tobacco farmer like him, without stock market investments, would not feel the impact immediately. He went out to play target shooting with his neighbors, laughed and enjoyed himself. And then, he decided to go into the forest to hunt a rabbit. Do you remember that his wife, Fanny, found him one of those afternoons or nights crying on his knees near a tree, pleading with the sky, praying, totally lost? Well, in that region of North Carolina, there was something very peculiar, an ancestral legend known as Devil's Tramping Ground. These were clearings in the forests, perfect circles where vegetation simply did not grow, or around solitary trees. Anciently, the Algonquian tribes that inhabited those territories maintained that unclean beings, evil spirits of the forests, creatures similar to the fearsome Wendigo that lived further north, the spirit of man-eaters, the one that drove people to cannibalistic madness, dwelled there. In this region, it was said that in those circles the devil himself had come to seek souls. Do you remember what Charlie did last before taking his own life? He walked in circles around a tree until the snow under his feet melted, and then shot himself. For many people in the region, the explanation is chilling. Charlie was attacked by a forest demon, a malignant entity that took possession of his mind and compelled him to commit the atrocity. Yes, I know it may seem very strange, but back then, in those rural communities, these things were talked about. They were believed in, with a faith almost as deep as religious faith. It is a hypothesis that, although implausible to the modern mind, fits into the folklore and worldview of the time. In short, the fact is that, after the death and solemn burial of the Lawson family, things did not end there. Charlie's relatives, particularly his brother Marion, conceived a macabre and exploitative idea: to exhibit the house. For a few coins, people could enter and see what had happened in the house of horror. Even the cake that Marie had prepared with so much care, and which they never got to eat, remained on the table, a silent testimony to the truncated life. People passed by, looked, and in an act of voyeurism and desecration, stole objects as souvenirs. Photographs of the scene were taken, a somber memory of the tragedy. It is even said that John Dillinger, the famous criminal of the era, visited the house and left a note taped to the wall. John Dillinger was here. The blood-stained walls, the shattered furniture, everything was on display. The very weapons recovered from the massacre were shown to the public. The supposed reason behind this exhibition was to raise money for Arthur, the sole survivor of the family, so he would have something to start anew. But the farm, in reality, was lost. When Charlie died, the bank, receiving no further payments, took possession of the property. It was then, when it was sold again, that the exhibition ceased. Finally, that house of horror was demolished, its timbers dismantled. It is said that part of that wood was used to build a covered bridge over a nearby creek, an ironic fate for the remains of a house that witnessed such evil. Charlie died that night in a strange way, with the snow melted in a circle around him. But Arthur himself, the only one Charlie had spared, would also not have a long or peaceful life. He would die in 1945, at the young age of 32. He had given himself over to alcohol, and in a tragic car accident, driving drunk, he met his own death. Everything around that place, that family, seemed to be marked by death and misfortune. And, you know what? For years, people from those regions have claimed that the old bridge, the one built with wood from the Lawson house, is full of ghosts. I don't know if it's still standing, but the farm itself is said to be haunted, that on winter nights, one can hear children's laughter, screams of terror, the ineffable horror of that macabre Christmas night, when Charlie Lawson, inexplicably, ended his entire family, leaving behind an eternal echo of mystery and pain.